And I've got a different, my talk is going to be very different because it's going to be full of gossip. And it's going to handle a couple of things, but I'm going to give you a list of what it's going to deal with. It's going to deal with Marx's daughters, Malthusianism, Fawcett's, bourgeois, the Fawcett's, bourgeois feminists, proletarian feminists, the 1876 Employment of Women Act, and Edith Lanchester. So you see, it doesn't cover exactly the same things, but it overlaps. Marx's daughters. Now, Marx got married, as you know, to a woman called Jenny. He called all of his 3 daughters Jenny as well, though luckily he also gave them another name by which we know them. He was really madly in love with his wife, and between 1844 and 1857, they had, which was 13 years, they had 7 children. 1 died at birth, 2 died when they were toddlers, a little boy Edgar died when he was 8, which left 3 girls to grow up. And that was quite normal at the time. Not that so many children died, but in a short space of time, like 14 years, you'd have that many children. There was an expression the Victorian used about having children when you got married, and they called it the inevitable consequences of marriage. They wouldn't say so-and-so's pregnant. They'd say, oh, the inevitable consequences of marriage. And it does mean that if you got married, you would spend, normally, a lot of time pregnant and a lot of time recovering from being pregnant. And that did change things. It changed, actually, people's expectations for their daughters. And it actually changed Marx. I don't think Marx thought that his daughters were in any way stupid. In fact, he thought they were very brilliant. Jenny used to write articles, especially about Ireland. Laura did a lot of translation from into French of her father's works. They were, they were very bright. He thought they were wonderful, but he didn't bother to send them to school. Now, this was actually a little bit unusual at the time. They went to a sort of school around the corner where they learnt languages and stuff, because it was quite normal where he lived. And some of his friends, one of them with the most ridiculous name called Dobson Collett Dobson, and who was a great friend of his, and he was on the IWMA, and he always supported Marx, and he sent his daughters to a school called the North London Collegiate Institute, which was round the corner, and Eleanor could have easily have gone there. It was 6 guineas, well, all of them could, because it opened in 1850. It was 6 guineas a term, and Engels would have paid. They didn't really see the point. Why didn't they see the point? Well, it had a sort of very sort of religious ethos. It was a bit jolly hockey sticks. There are reasons why, quite logical reasons why he wouldn't send his daughters there. What's slightly perhaps more surprising, the 2 eldest daughters were married young. One of them was married for 11 years before she died and had 6 children. The other one had 3 children. She was married a lot longer, but after she had the 3rd child, she couldn't have any more, and all those children died. That's another story. Now, Eleanor was 22 when the University College London opened its doors to women, and girls started to go. And they started to go en masse. In fact, in 1879, I think I've just gone through it, about 25% of the intake were women, because there was this pent-up demand. Eleanor never considered going. Why not? Well, she thought she was engaged to be married. Marx told her she wasn't. He was totally unsuitable. And until he actually proves he's better than his reputation, except I won't do his accent, he just wouldn't consider it. But she thought she was engaged to be married to him, and he changed his mind. So actually, I think she was anticipating that she'd get pregnant, and there wasn't much point. She didn't underestimate herself. She worked. She did a lot of translation of early and middle English texts and work on Shakespeare for a guy called F.J. Furnivall, which if you know anything about sort of early literature, you'll know his name. And she worked for him as a devil, and as you know, she got politically involved. But even when she didn't marry this guy called Lissagaray, the guy who wrote a book called The Commune of Paris, which I think you might have come across, and which Eleanor in fact translated into English, and is a wonderful book. Marx said it was a wonderful book, even though the guy wasn't a Marxist. And that's very interesting. Marx wouldn't let his daughter marry her, but he thought he was politically okay and would let her but he just, but I'm not going into too much gossip about that, because I want to go because a lot of bourgeois people have sort of a remark on the lack of education of Marx's daughters. They had a lack of formal education. And there was a change. A lot of women who got interested in education at that time and wanted an education didn't marry. And it was almost like if you were going to be a woman doctor, then you wouldn't marry, because actually what would be the point? Because if you got married, it wouldn't be that you'd have one child or two children or three, you'd have maybe 10 or 12. And it would be very difficult to be a doctor if you were always pregnant. So actually, one of the first things for the liberation of women really has been not having a baby every year or so. Because you can't really do much in the world if you're always having babies. And if you actually look at the revolutionary women, you will see that they weren't in situations where they were always... Clara Zetkin, I think, had 2. Now, there was birth control coming in, and Marxists, on the whole, didn't support it. Now, they didn't support it because they were against women's liberation. It was because it was very much tied up with Malthusian ideology. The ideology that the poverty of working class people was actually created by there being too many working class people. Radicals, not socialists, took up this idea, and you'll get a lot of radicals got interested in birth control at this time in the 1870s. I mean, but the thing is, you can be interested in birth control and have some ideas about it, but it doesn't make it mean to say it was very effective. I won't go into the details too much because it's vulgar. But for example, in one of the early radical birth control books, they advised what was called a safe period, which we now know to be is exactly the opposite of the safe period. So, I mean, these books weren't exactly reliable, but they were, I will say, they were Malthusian, and they mostly argued that birth control would solve the problem of working class poverty. Now, obviously, no socialist is going to accept that. They could accept, so socialists would accept birth control on the grounds of women's autonomy, and they'd accept it for women's health, but they also had this thing, is we actually don't want to reduce the working class population because we want to be strong. We want to take over. So there were these, you actually got the early Marxists, the first Marxist party in Britain, the Socialist Democratic Federation, would actually have speakers mostly in, what's that park, Victoria Park, where they would be denouncing birth control. But they would be denouncing birth control for Malthusian economic reasons. Now, Marx doesn't say much about Malthus. He doesn't write a pamphlet about Malthus, and what he says about Malthus is scattered in his work. He calls it a libel on the human race, because man's ingenuity can solve every problem that there is. And every mouth that's born, any child that's born with a mouth to feed has also got arms to work, and he's got a brain to think. And that was his position. And he was very keen on children, Marx. He was very, very fond of children. And as you know, he was also very fond of dogs. Otherwise, we wouldn't be supporting him, would we? I know you'll cut that. In fact, you'll probably cut it all. But anyway, so where does this go into? Malthusianism. Malthusian economics, as well as feminism, were actually tied off quite often together with radicals. The two things were together. And you get a bourgeois feminist called Millicent Fawcett, who I'm sure you've all heard of, and there's a Fawcett Society, and she's the great heroine, and she was fighting for the franchise. Now, she was married to a man of evil, who was actually the Postmaster General. And one of the things he did as Postmaster General made it very easy for women to become workers in the post office. But he was very much wedded to the idea of poverty being caused by the existence of working class people. And if we just sort of, basically, if we got rid of the surplus labour, they just couldn't cope with the idea that actually having, the surplus army of labour is actually intrinsic to capitalism. It was something that could, let's have fewer children, then there won't be one. They just couldn't get it. And anyway, bourgeois feminists. Now, the bourgeois feminists also, of course, infected some trade unionism. And I want to sort of mention the Crosses Act. In 1876, an act was introduced, a bill was introduced, in fact, by a Tory government who actually made things a bit easier for trade unions, because in contrast to the Liberals, who are very, very, like the neocons now, very, very pro-capitalist, the Tories in those days would sometimes sort of get a bit floppy. And they got a little bit floppy in a way that really, really offended the sort of bourgeois liberal feminist. They brought in a bill, and you're not going to believe this. It was the Women and Children's Act to reduce the number of hours women could work in factories to a mere 57 a week. Well, what an outrage. This was infantilizing women. This was absolutely shocking. So you got Millicent Fawcett, and you got Annie Beasant, who's another great radical feminist, absolutely outraged about this and fighting it all the way, and also all the way up to at the 1889 inaugural congresses of the Second International. They were fighting this idea that you should reduce women's working hours. I mean, especially to anything as low as 57 hours. As Annie Besant said, but supposing a woman can't earn enough in 57 hours, you are actually you're sending this woman to starvation. Anyway, enough of that. I'm not very fond of bourgeois feminists. I'm sort of keener, as you may have noticed, I'm keener on the feminists that looked at the women's situation. Now, trade unionism, as we all know, in Britain was very much attached to the Liberal Party. The TUC was, what did they call it? The tail end of the Liberal Party is what Marx called a lot of the trade union movement. But it was divided, and you were getting people in it who were becoming more socialistic. And of course, they wanted not only to push for the reduction in women's and children's working hours as a good in itself, they wanted it because they wanted to piggyback a reduction in the ferocious hours of male labour. Because 57 hours being a reduction, you can imagine what a lot of men worked, and of course the 8-hour movement was very much to do with the Second International. So there was a division between socialists. There was, of course, a socialist feminism. Of course, socialist feminism was different. It demanded, obviously, improved conditions of work. It demanded equal pay. Absolutely. Equal pay was a demand of socialism. It was a demand in the IWMA, and it was a demand, obviously, in the Second International, where women were beginning to enter the workforce, the middle-class workforce more. Women, proletarian women, have always worked, as we've known. They would quite often stop for a little while when they had children, but not necessarily. And I'm not going to go into the setup of nurseries and stuff like that. I want to talk about the franchise. Fawcett is the franchise that was being fought for by Millicent Fawcett, and also by the Pankhursts, except for Sylvia, was the same property franchise as existed for men. Socialists, of course, were fighting for an adult franchise, which was universal franchise, a franchise for all men and women over the age of 21.
So what was the property qualification for voting?
In 1867, some in the artisans, there was a £10 freehold. If you had a £10 freehold, you could vote. So that brought in some towns, depending on some towns that property is worth more in some towns than in others. In some areas, that would bring some of the better off working class men into being able to vote. And it's also when they set up mortgage companies, so that instead of renting, because renting was quite traditional, they were sort of liberal and radical societies that were set up as mortgage companies so that people would be able to buy a £10 franchise so they could vote. Remember, there's no secret ballot. So when in 1867 there was the £10 franchise was introduced, if you did get a mortgage through these liberal and radical organisations, you would actually have to vote Liberal because there's no secret ballot until 1872. In 1884, some agricultural workers were also given the vote. But the poorest of the working class, the vast majority of working class men, the vast majority, that's about 60%, didn't get the vote until 1918. So when all these bourgeois feminists were fighting for the vote for themselves, they were fighting, Eleanor Marx used to call it the ladies' vote. And it was very, very much. And she wouldn't be at all, she was wonderful and active. I will, if I'm invited, I will come and give a talk sometimes on Eleanor Marx, because she's a marvellous activist. And she would always decry the bourgeois feminist. She said there is nothing in common between a working class woman and a Rothschild. Because she's a woman. You know, it's not a nonsense. And anyway, I can't talk anymore because I've talked too long and I am being gossipy and I'm going to be eliminated, I know, from what have you. But I just want to mention Edith Lanchester because you mentioned her. You did, you mentioned Edith Lanchester. Edith Lanchester was a Marxist. She used to type things out for Eleanor Marx, and she was put in a loony bin by her parents because she wanted to live with a man without being married to him. And it was a whole big scandal. And when you read my book, you will find it in there. I'm not even going to mention the name of it. But when you read my book, when you read my encyclopedia, you can read that. So that's actually just a trailer. Okay, that's it. So I did say I was only going to talk for 10 or 15 minutes, and it wouldn't be anything like Jyoti's, and it hasn't been.
Okay. You've been over there.
Yeah, I'm all right.
40 minutes maybe.
No, I'm fine. That's all I wanted to do, is a little bit of light relief.